We in focus? We're in focus. We can see all of my zits. Excellent! Love that for me. Alright, well, happy Halloween, or Samhain, or end of October for those who, like me, grew up in families that actively avoided having anything to do with the other two. I guess it's NaNoWriMo Eve for us. This year, as my Halloween story, I'm going to be telling Echtra Nerai, which is a story I was vaguely aware of for a while, but had never really looked at in depth until this week, and it was actually really fun to research, so I'm quite excited about this. Echtra Nerai, or The Adventure of Nera in English, is usually classified as belonging to the Ulster cycle because it's positioned as a revscale or foretale to the Tyne. I've told a few of these revscaler now. It's said to take place at the same time as Longman, which I told in the past, so the same year that Fergus goes into exile in Connacht. But unlike Longman, it's not a story you really need in order to understand what's going on in the Tyne. You can pretty much follow Time Coolinga without ever having heard of Echtra Nerai, as evidenced by the fact I had never really read it until this week. Unless, that is, you only have the first recension. While the second recension of the Tyne has the Pillow Talk episode, where Medivh and Alil have their marital dispute that leads to the rest of the events of the Tyne, the first recension doesn't, it just kind of starts in the midst of the action. It could be that Echtra Nerai provides a missing piece here, an alternative explanation for why Medivh is mustering her armies for the sake of a cow. But I'm getting distracted, and if you read the Tyne in a modern translation like Kinsella's or Carson's, it joins the recensions together, so you probably have no idea what I'm talking about anyway, so let's move on. Now, the main manuscript where we find this one is a fairly late one. I think it's 16th century, but the text looks like it's probably 10th century based on the language used. At least that's what Turnisen said, and I tend to go with Turnisen because I don't understand that kind of thing. I would show you a picture of the manuscript, but it doesn't look like the British Library has digitised that one, so I guess we'll just suffer. There is a translation of it in this book, The Celtic Heroic Age, by John Carey, and that's the version I'm working from. Alright, let's just... Whew. As I said, this is an Ulster cycle text, but it mainly takes place in Connacht, which is unusual and interesting. Nera is one of the Connachter, and some academics have read the story as pretty explicitly pro-Connacht in its narrative, which is unusual considering they're usually presented as the bad guys in the Ulster cycle. And of course the reason I'm telling this story today is because it takes place at Samhain, or Halloween, and also involves a talking corpse and lots of otherworldly shenanigans, which makes it on theme for the day that's in it. Obviously, if you're not watching this at Halloween, it's a cool story anyway, stick around. So, long ago, at Samhain, Alil and Medivh and their whole household were at Rathcruachan, which is, at the time, like the centre of the Connachta's power. It's in modern County Roscommon, I think. They were preparing their dinner when Alil decided to challenge his men to a bravery contest. A very high-stakes game of truth and dare. Except just dare. I dare you, he said, to go and tie a supple twig around the foot of one of those 2 prisoners we executed yesterday. If you succeed, I'll give you anything you want. Fun games, that Alil. Now, the Connachta aren't meant to back down from a dare, but it was, after all, Samhain, a night of darkness and horror where demons are known to appear, or so the text tells us. Each of them went out and tried, but none of them succeeded. Finally, Nera stood up. I'll do it, he said. What will you give me if I succeed? Alil promised him his gold-hilted sword, recognition from a king to a hero. So Nera went out, heavily armed, because he's not an idiot, and tried to fix the supple twig around the foot of the hanged man. But no matter what he did, it would not stay where he put it. Finally, the corpse speaks up and tells him to put a special spike in it because he can be there all year and it's never going to stay put without one. Nera is the kind of person to take advice from corpses, and so he does as he's told, and it works. Well done, says the corpse. Now that you've done that, carry me on your back until I can get a drink, will you? I was already thirsty when they hanged me and, well, it's hard work being dead. I ask on your honour as a warrior. This is the kind of thing that Nera can't refuse, so he takes the dead man onto his back and follows his directions to the nearest house. But this house is surrounded by a lake of fire. Now, we're not going to find a drink here, says the dead man. These guys are too good at keeping their fire going. Let's move on. So they go to the next house, but this one is surrounded by a lake of water. Now, not this one either, says the dead man. These people never leave out their dirty washing up water overnight. They always chuck it out. Let's move on. Third time lucky. The dead man insists on being put down at the third house and goes inside. The used washing up water and bathing water is still standing in its tubs in the house, and the dead man drinks from each of them, then spits the last mouthful out onto the faces of the people in the house, who die. The moral here, we're told, is that you shouldn't leave wastewater out overnight or fail to rake up your hearth fire. So it's like preventative hygiene measures, but being presented as supernatural, a kind of recognition that leaving water out isn't great, but here presented as because dead people might come and spit it at you. I think we should, like, do that with masks. If you don't wear a mask, Wait, but threat of dead people really doesn't seem to be working, does it? Anyway, getting sidetracked. So then Nera takes the dead man back to being dead and returns to Rath Cruachan, except it's not there. The whole place has been burned down and its people killed, their heads heaped up by their enemies. For reasons I can't entirely figure out, Nera's response to a pile of heads and everyone he knows being dead is to follow the enemy army through into the cave of Cruachan, which by the way is an actual archaeological place and the location of our first mention of Medov. And so he goes through the cave into the Sheath, or the Otherworld. When he gets there, the king of the Sheath asks him what he's doing and he says he's just accompanying the army. No biggie. The king directs him towards a house where a woman lives, saying to tell her that he sent him, and also tells him to bring a bundle of firewood each day to the king's house. Not exactly a fitting job for a hero like Nera, but that's the Otherworld. Things are topsy-turvy. And so it goes. Every day Nera carries wood to the king's court, and every day he sees a blind man carrying a lame man coming out of the court. They go to the edge of a spring that's in front of the court. "Is it there?" asks the blind man. "It's there," says the lame man. "Let's go." After watching this for a bit, Nera eventually asks the woman what they're doing. "Oh, they're visiting the crown in the spring," says the woman. "They're the only ones the king trusts to check on it." This is a strong hint this is a story about sovereignty and kingship and good kings and bad kings and what that means for their people. We're told a little later on that this is Brion's crown, which shows up in other texts as part of a list of 3 marvellous items, although they're not always the same items. Anyway, Nera seems less interested in the crown right now and more in finding out what is going on in his life, which understandable. He asks the woman to explain to him what's going on. Like, how was Rath Cruachan destroyed that quickly? How was the whole household killed while he was busy taking a dead man on a deeply disappointing pub crawl? "Oh," she says, "yeah, they're not dead." What he'd seen wasn't the present, it was the future, or a possible future if he doesn't warn his people. Despite it being a pretty obvious betrayal of her own people, the woman tells him to leave the Sheath, go back to Rath Cruachan and warn them. She tells him that they won't even notice he's been gone, even though as far as he's concerned he's been in the Sheath for 3 days and 3 nights. Nera's worried they won't believe him, so the woman gives him summer flowers to take back with him as proof that he's been in the Sheath, where the seasons are different. "Oh, and by the way," she says, "I'm gonna have your son," so that gives us a clue what they've been up to for these 3 days. "Make sure to warn me, will you, when you're getting your people to come attack the Sheath, because that way I can get your cattle out of here." So Nera goes back to his people and tells them the story, and Alil gives him the sword, and he stays with them for the rest of the year, which we are told here is the year that Fergus came to Connacht in exile. As the next Samhain approaches, Alil says, "Oh, you should get going, you need to go get your wife and cattle from the Sheath before we attack." Nera goes to the Sheath, and his wife welcomes him. "Right," she says, "get on up to court with this bundle of firewood. I've been doing your job for a year now. I told them you were ill." Nera goes to the court. "You're alive," says the king. "Glad to see you're looking better. Not so thrilled about the fact you slept with that woman without my permission, though." And Nera's just kind of like, "Well, you didn't tell me not to." Goes back to his wife. She tells him to look after his cows and mentions that she gave his son one of the cows when he was born. Usually the job for the head of the household, but she has been doing both of their jobs for a year. Turns out, though, that heroes make really crap cow herds because Nera falls asleep while watching the cattle. And the Morrigan turns up and nicks his son's cow. Don't you just hate it when that happens? She takes it to go and mate with Don Coolingar being the brown bull of Cooley that causes so much trouble in the time. On her way back, she runs into Cuchulainn, who is distinctly grumpy about her coming and bringing cows in and out of his territory because it's one of his geshi, or prohibitions, not to let cattle leave without him knowing about it. This has very little bearing on the story, and this is the only time Cuchulainn appears, but I think it's interesting that he's here at all because he's not in Longus MacNicholin, and this makes it hard to justify that as him being either not born or not in the country. So yay! More chronological weirdness. Anyway, Nera comes home with the rest of the cows and confesses to his wife that he lost his son's cow. And she's like, just can't get the staff. But as she's saying that, the cow returns. Nera's like, "What? How did this happen?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, that cow's been to Cooley to mate with the Don Coolingar. So cool." And she tells Nera to go home because their warbands aren't going to act until next Samhain. Some people theorise that this story is a compilation, and that does kind of make sense because there's too many years happening here and it's a bit weirdly repetitive in the middle. But it's interesting that every time something happens, it's at Samhain, because the story tells us the sheathed mounds of Ireland were always open at Samhain. Doors to the Otherworld. You can just wander in and out. Nera goes back to Alil and Medivh, who ask him where he's been. Again, even though they told him to go there. This is what I mean about the repetition. He tells them and warns them about the attack happening next Samhain. So they chillax for another year until 3 days before Samhain, when Alil tells Nera to go and get his stuff from the sheath, which I'm pretty sure he told him the previous year. He goes to fetch his cattle, but when he's bringing them out, his son's cow utters 3 great bellows, so loud it can be heard all the way from where Alul and Fergus are playing Fifthkill. "That sounds bad," says Fergus, and makes a prophecy about all the trouble this particular cow is going to cause for them. This is, as far as I know, the only instant of Fergus making the prophecy, and seems to be related to his kind of liminal statuses. He's just left the Alul. He's not really in the Connachter yet. It's just kind of there. In-betweeny dude. And in-betweeny dudes can give prophecies. It's also probably worth mentioning here that this section of the story, basically from when the Morrigan turned up, is a fragmentary version of a text called Toyn Beregevna. If I knew anything interesting about that text, I would tell you it, but I don't. So let's go back to this one. The calf, which is the son of the Don Cúlinge, encounters Finn Benech, the White Bull of Connacht, and they fight for a day and a night, until finally the calf is beaten. It lets out a despondent bellow. "What was that?" says Medivh. "Oh, that's just Fergus's singing," says Brickcrew, because his job is basically to insult everyone, and he's very good at it. At which point Fergus smashes Brickcrew's face in, and the 5 Fifthkill pieces that he's holding in his hand get embedded in Brickcrew's head. That's what true friendship's about. Pro tip: don't insult Fergus's singing. Apparently he's kind of sensitive about it. Medivh's cowherd, which is who she'd actually been asking about this, can apparently interpret cow speech, useful skill for a cowherd, because he's able to tell them what the noise actually meant. The calf was challenging Finn Benech to fight his father, the Don Cúlinge, because surely the White Bull would lose that fight. Well, Medivh clearly cannot resist the prospect of a bullfight, because she makes an oath that she will not rest until the day she sees those 2 bulls fighting in front of her, which, if you've read the Tyne, you'll know does happen at the end of the text. So is this then an alternative explanation for why Medivh's army invaded Ulster? Not because of a marital dispute, but because she's just really hyped to see some bulls beat each other up? It's interesting to consider that, especially as, because I mentioned the Pillow Talk episode that otherwise explains it, isn't in all versions of the story. But what about Nera and the Sheath, since that's the story we're actually telling? Well, the Connachter and the Ulster exiles, Fergus and his men, go and attack the Sheath now, ravaging it and nicking all their stuff, including the crown of Brion. Sovereignty has passed to Connacht. But Nera and his family stay in the Sheath, and he has not come out yet, and he will not come out until the end of the world, the text tells us. And that's the end of the adventure of Nera. Is he dead? Is he now immortal and living in the Otherworld? It's up to you. I could go into a lot more detailed analysis of the story, but I think it's more fun if I leave it up to you to think about how you'd explain it. But still, if you're interested in some detailed readings, I will drop a couple of links in the description to articles that I found interesting in the process of researching this. If you've enjoyed this video, want to support my research, or just have too much money and want to participate in some redistribution of wealth, there is a link to my Ko-fi page in the description. Please do drop a few quid in my tip jar. You'll also find links to all of my social media, including my blog, which is shock horror actually active at the moment, including a recent post about queer theory and medieval Irish lit, which may interest some of you. And finally, if you are rescuing your lover from the Fairy Queen tonight, please make sure you've checked whether the fairy host observes any kind of daylight savings time so that you don't accidentally miss them, because I'm pretty sure that's how you condemn your boyfriend to hell. See you soon!